What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another SK Wealth Academy podcast number 153. Why positive change in the political process is only possible by voting independent this November 3rd. Now, I know I've yet to upload podcast number 151 because I skipped from number 150 to 152, but I will upload 151 shortly. Just as a PSA, podcast number 151 will be available only on Podbean. So the URL to download, and it's going to be available on a downloadable MP3 file, is skwealthacademy.podbean.com. And the reason it's only going to be available through audio format was because I accidentally deleted the video file. So I don't have the time to re-record the video file for podcast 151. So unfortunately, that one will only be available by downloadable MP3 file on Podbean. Okay, and also on Spotify. So I'll put all the links below. I haven't actually checked to see if my podcasts have been made available on iTunes as of yet, so I'll put that in the show notes. I'll go check. So before I get started, let me just tell you very quickly, there's only 3 weeks left in my GoFundMe campaign to raise money for the eventual launch of my 22 online course academy that will basically cover all the knowledge of wealth building that no university, I don't care if it's Harvard Business School or the MBA program at Oxford, you're not going to learn about the things you learn in my course at either of those schools, as well as other fundamentally important courses for education, such as critical thinking skill development that has been completely absent from all schooling for the last few decades at a minimum. So that is going to constitute the curriculum of my 22 course online academy. If you'd like to help me launch it, there's still just 3 weeks left, and you can go visit. Again, I'll put the URL in the show notes to this podcast, but it's also gofundme.com/F like fight/SK Wealth Academy. So let's get started. Okay, so why do I say no positive change in the political process is possible except by voting independent? And this is just not in the upcoming US presidential election. This also applies to the upcoming South Korean presidential election in 2022, the upcoming elections in Canada, Australia, wherever it may be. I know the national elections in New Zealand just passed, so it would apply to those particular elections as well. It applies to all national elections across the board in any nation. Let me start by saying that what actually sparked the idea for this particular podcast is that I came across an article, stumbled across an article that said Jennifer Aniston says it's not funny to vote for Kanye West, because we all know that rapper, hip-hop mogul Kanye West is running for US president. And I think he's only on ballots of 11 states, but you can write him in as a write-in candidate on many other states during this upcoming US presidential election. Because basically this ex-Friends star was saying is that, a common thing we've always heard is that if you cast a vote for Kanye West, you're just wasting your vote. You know what is really wasting your vote? Voting for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, or voting for Donald Trump and Mike Pence. Now, I'm sure there are many Americans out there that are fans of the Friends show in which Jennifer Aniston starred that will vote Democrat just because they worship at the celebrity altar of Jennifer Aniston. Now, actually, I didn't even read that article. I just saw the headlines, and the headline sparked this. So I'm assuming, because most of Hollywood is liberal, or at least it's perceived. It may not necessarily actually even be liberal, because in many ways it's very conservative. But it's worked very diligently on promoting a perception that it's liberal. So I'm just assuming Jennifer Aniston's a Democrat. I have no idea. Maybe she's a Republican. But whatever way she was urging people to vote for, I'm sure there are people that are friends, that are fans of her because she was an actor on the mega hit US TV show Friends, and will just vote for whatever she's telling her fans to vote, whichever direction. Now, Trump, for all those that still don't think he's part of the oligarchy, all we have to do is just observe what happened during this recent economic lockdown. Who gained nearly all the wealth that was increased during this period of lockdown? The billionaires, right? Bezos of Amazon, Zuckerberg of Facebook, Elon Musk of Tesla, and a handful. I think those were the three biggest winners. Bill Gates of Microsoft was another really big winner of this lockdown. And I think also because Walmart on a retail level was deemed essential while all small businesses were ravaged and raped during this lockdown. So probably the Sam Walton family of Walmart also accrued additional billions of dollars of wealth. Now, cumulatively, the billionaires gathered another $640 billion of wealth, roughly, during this lockdown, while the entire middle class in America and the poor became much poorer. Now, also, who else became richer during this economic lockdown? The bankers, right? So we saw US banking shares recover in share price. Also, US bankers received trillions of dollars of bailout money through the overnight repo markets to solve a liquidity crisis that, again, with the assistance of the mass financial media, was completely hidden from public view thanks to their constant focus on a viral crisis that is not even that lethal, that has been deliberately and conveniently used to misdirect people's attention away from the ongoing economic crisis to just this panic and fear and constant fear mongering about the virus. Now, we've all forgotten, right, what happened at the very start of this year when U.S. stock markets started to crash. That necessitated an emergency meeting from U.S. central bankers to cut the Fed's fund rate all the way back down to zero. Now, again, in comparison, what was the government assistance offered to American citizens relative to the assistance offered to the billionaire class and the wealthiest corporate sectors in America, like banking? The government assistance to regular people, regular American citizens, in relation to the assistance offered to the wealthiest segment of Americans was comical. If the stimulus checks offered to U.S. citizens rivaled the stimulus money granted to bankers and billionaires, all U.S. citizens would be millionaires by now, because it wouldn't be only a fraction of the income that they earned from the job they held before the lockdowns basically destroyed their jobs and were responsible for them being laid off or let go. So they had no income as composed to living wage prior to the lockdowns. These economic stimulus checks, were they to rival the bailouts given to the bankers and to the Wall Street billionaires and the corporate billionaires, would have to comprise not a fraction of the income they're earning before they lost their jobs from the lockdown, but would not only have to comprise 100% of their pre-lockdown income, it would have to be like 200% to be comparable to the assistance offered to the extremely wealthy, 200% of the pre-lockdown income, plus an additional 25 to 50% to compensate for the period that will be required for them to find a new job once the economy is open back up. Because as we know, nothing is going to snap back like that. So it's going to take maybe another 3-4 quarters for the economy really to get going once things open back up. So if you think this is a feature distinct to how the state treats its citizens to the United States, you'd be gravely mistaken. Because in China too, guess what happened? Economic lockdowns crushed the financial livelihoods of millions of regular citizens, while the oligarchs parlayed the lockdowns fortuitously into $1.5 trillion of additional wealth. Granted, there are 1.4 billion Chinese versus 330 million Americans, so you would expect their growth in overall wealth to be much larger than in America, right? Because that's a population that's like 5 times the size of America. So, and in fact, if you were to look at, as I told you, the growth in wealth of American billionaires was about 640 billion in wealth. So were you to multiply that 5 times, that would be what? 6.4 times 5, 2, carry the 2 up. That would be over 3.2 trillion dollars, right? So I told you the Chinese increased their wealth by 1.5 trillion. So relatively speaking, actually per capita, the growth in billionaire wealth in America was greater, although the nominal amount in China at 1.5 trillion was much greater. So there's a researcher, Rupert Hogarth, I don't know how you pronounce his last name. It's really irrelevant what his name is, but he basically was the one that compiled the data that said the Chinese oligarchs gained $1.5 trillion of additional wealth during the lockdowns. He quoted, "The world has never seen this much wealth created in just 1 year." Now marinate on this statement for just a minute, because I'm sure no one that is watching this particular video or listening to this particular podcast on Podbean is thinking, wow, my wealth has grown so much this year. Because neither has the world ever seen such a period of enormous wealth destruction for the middle class and poor during a 1-year period either. And understand that within the same year, think about how mind-blowing this is. The greatest period of wealth creation happened globally for billionaires in 2020, simultaneously with the greatest percentage of wealth destruction for the middle class and poor. If you can understand that those two incidents that never intersect in the Venn diagram should not happen simultaneously, then you may begin to finally connect the dots regarding the agenda of the ruling class in these economic lockdowns. Again, the point of extending the economic lockdowns as long as possible in regard to the ruling class's agenda and their false narrative that the virus is responsible for the exploding economic misery around the world, when clearly it was politicized lockdowns, not the virus, that were responsible for well over 99% of the economic misery that was created worldwide. Additionally, central banking monetary policy since the 2008 global financial crisis, not the virus, created the conditions at the start of this year that led to the rapid deterioration of hundreds of millions of people's economic livelihoods once economic lockdowns began. So the conditions were ripe for hundreds of millions of people's financial livelihoods to rapidly deteriorate once the lockdowns were enforced, but the responsibility behind creating those conditions fall squarely on the shoulders of central bankers and the monetary policies that they inflicted upon the world since 2008. And again, I mentioned that necessitated, as many people have already forgotten, an emergency U.S. central banker meeting in March of this past year to cut the Fed's fund interest rate to zero when the regularly scheduled interest rate decision meeting was just a few, I can't remember, it was a few days to like a couple weeks later. So they couldn't, that in itself should have made a lot of you think that there was something that was not being told to us about this emergency interest rate cut that happened in March of 2020. The fact that they could not even wait a few more days or a couple of weeks to make that interest rate cut. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, then look at the podcast show notes. Go watch the video I published back in March, because I told people the reason why in a podcast I released titled "The Real Reason the Feds Just Panic Cut Interest Rates to Zero." So since I explained it all in that podcast, I'm not going to vomit that information again here. So again, due to the mass media focusing all attention on the virus, no one in the media even pretended to investigate the real reasons why the US central bankers could not even wait a few more days to a couple of weeks before announcing or before executing an interest rate cut back to zero. Now, the irony of people like Jennifer Aniston stating, oh, it's not funny to vote for Kanye West because you're just going to waste your vote in the political capital of the Democratic Party, is the fact that the US currently has a president that had zero political experience before being elected. And even with our current incumbent President Trump, as well as most other nations' state leaders like PM Trudeau in Canada, they're merely figureheads with much more powerful people behind the scenes really running the show. So the fact that Kanye has no political experience would be no more of a detriment to his ability to quote unquote run the nation than Trump's zero political experience before he became POTUS, President of the United States. So the reason why people that really want real change in America are much better voting for Kanye or any of the other dozens of independent party presidential candidates is going to take up the bulk of the rest of this podcast. Now, again, because the majority of people today have little to no critical thinking skills and people are always twisting my words, let me reiterate just one more time before I continue what I've already stated. What makes Kanye qualified to be president of the United States? Nothing. That's not what I say, but people often hear me say something or say exactly why people that want real change in America are much better voting for Kanye or any of the other independent party candidates. And they'll twist my words and say, oh, you think Kanye's qualified to be president of the United States? How stupid are you? And I've never have said anything remotely close to that. But I'm telling you why voting for an independent non-party member of the two-party system is the only viable means of helping citizens and the people gain power in this political process down the road. So don't put rubbish comments in the comments section similar to like, oh, so you think Kanye could run this country better than Trump or better than Biden? Because those are the comments of either a fool, given that I've been very explicit, and that's not what I'm saying, or if you make such comments, I'm going to assume that you're either 8 years old or younger or have the intellect of someone 8 years old or younger. And even though I always state that you have to always take any poll results with a grain of salt, because most times, polls are funded by organizations that have political agendas and they want to fund a poll to yield a desired result that fits their agenda, and then they release their poll results nationwide through some mass media distribution channel that will influence people's opinions and their beliefs, because often nobody questions the extremely questionable levels of poll methodology robustness. So that's why I say you always have to be skeptical regarding any poll results that are reported unless you've taken the time to actually study the robustness of the poll methodology. And so I'm just going to quote these because I actually didn't take the time to go read all about the poll methodology. I don't even know if it was provided, if I actually went to the actual poll, because sometimes the methodology is not even provided. So you can't even discover this information. But let me just tell you on a very base level that even though we need to be skeptical of these results, I'm just going to report them for the sake of making a point. So a recent poll run by the Pew Foundation yielded poll results that stated nearly 9 out of every 10 Americans were dissatisfied with the current state of America. In other words, they said 87% of thousands of Americans polled said they were dissatisfied. 87% is tad under 90%, or nearly 9 out of every 10. That normally, poll results like this would be the death knell for an incumbent president during an election year, right? Because normally if people are dissatisfied with this current state of America, then they're going to vote out the president that is in power right now and vote in a new president, right? If they're dissatisfied, then that means normally they're dissatisfied with the current leader. Now, digging deeper into these poll numbers, the Pew Foundation survey also reported that 70% of polled respondents, of thousands of respondents, said they were quote unquote angry, and another 2 out of every 3 respondents said they were fearful about the state of America, which is an extremely volatile cocktail for violence to emerge from the election results should people not receive their desired outcome. Right? Because you have the majority of Americans saying they're either fearful or angry about the state of America. Now, as I stated, since the ruling class has very successfully implemented a binary decision-making model that only benefits them, never benefits us or any of the 330 million American citizens of the US, it's near guaranteed that hundreds of millions of Americans will be very angry about the election outcome after November 3rd, whatever that outcome may be. Now, imagine if the US presidential campaign was run in a manner in which a third option was provided on the ballot that said, quote, dissatisfied with both candidates. In other words, you could register a vote that said you're dissatisfied with both candidates. And if this third option garnered the most votes, this would necessitate a runoff with the opposition party in the election, in this case being the Democrats, and for future elections it could be the Republicans with an incumbent Democratic president. Then that party would have to offer another presidential, vice presidential pairing other than Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. In other words, if the choice that won in the election was dissatisfied with both candidates, the opposition party would have to offer another pairing on their ticket. And this would continue as long as the dissatisfied with both candidates was the majority, garnered the majority amount of votes in the election. So this is just the percentage of votes. It has nothing to do with winning electoral states. If the majority percentage of votes were cast for dissatisfied with both candidates, then the opposition party would have to provide another presidential, vice presidential candidate pairing until either that pairing won or the incumbent presidential, vice presidential pairing that was sitting in the White House at the present time won. And such a process would guarantee that the opposition party had to provide candidates that American citizens actually believed would serve them instead of the ruling oligarchy. But of course, such a logical change to the election process will never be approved, as oligarchs are only interested in getting incompetent people that will continue to maintain the current equilibrium and to serve their interests into power and not the interests of the people. So furthermore, as has been the historical case in US elections, though I imagine this election will see higher numbers, typically only 50% or about half, sometimes it's usually actually a little less than half of all eligible voters in America vote during a presidential election. But as there are massive numbers of Americans that never vote because they're dissatisfied with the Democratic and Republican candidate for presidency, and they don't think either one will serve them, that's why they stay home and don't vote. If a third option to vote existed of dissatisfied with both candidates that would subject the election process to the process I just explained to you, then I guarantee you that typical 50% of eligible voters that actually vote in an election would likely explode higher immediately to perhaps 75%, 80%, maybe even 90% of all eligible voters voting in the US presidential election. Including, I guarantee you, many people that have never voted in their entire lives showing up to vote because they know that there has to be an offering to them in their choices of someone they truly believe is going to serve their interests. But even without this third option, allow me to explain why this belief is, okay, let me rephrase that. Even without this third option, let me explain why people that were dissatisfied with both choices, they feel like they're shoved into this binary decision-making process. They can only vote Democrat, only vote Republican. Let me show you why that kind of thinking is completely wrong. And they feel they have no power because they actually still have a lot of power. So they've been only misled by the ruling class to believe they have zero power when they actually have a lot of power if they would only understand how to exercise it. So even though it is 99.99% guaranteed in this upcoming election, just a little over a week away, that no independent party member will win the US election, here's why voting for any candidate other than Trump or Biden would ultimately be the best strategy for anyone that understands that neither the incumbent Trump or the challenger Biden will serve their interests. So regardless of whether a US citizen votes for Ye, Joe Jorgensen, I think of the Libertarian Party, Howie Hawkins of the Green Party, Jesse Ventura, complete independent, Phil Collins, or any of the other dozens of independent party candidates that are running for US president this year. If the dozens of candidates were able to cumulatively capture 30% of the total vote, and I know that's unrealistic, but let me just bear with me through this hypothetical example so you can understand why people really have power and why the only power that they have to change the political process is by voting independent. Here's why this outcome would be the only one capable of forcing positive change in America, because I'm going to get around to how that cumulative vote could get up to 30%. Because even if the top non-Republican Democrat candidate, like this third-party independent party member, only captured the top one out of all the cumulative 30% votes that were cast for the smorgasbord of independent party candidates. Even if the top one only captured 3% of the overall vote, with all the rest of the, say, 15 or however many independent candidates there are, not able to capture any amount greater than 2% of the overall vote, with a lot capturing less than 1.5%. The very fact that 30% of all voters displayed their dissatisfaction to a high enough degree to cast a vote for someone other than one of the two-party candidates will be noticed. Trust me, will be noticed by whoever wins the election. And this will, for the first time in our lifetime, force the winning president to consider serving this 30% segment of the US voters that did not vote for him or his opponent into perhaps serving their interests. Now I'm going to explain why during the very first time this happens, the president will probably still ignore the interests of that 30% segment, but here's how it can be forced by the people exercising their power in unity to force the next presidential candidate to actually serve their interests. But here's what we know is 100% guaranteed. If you vote for Biden, if you vote for Trump, nothing's going to change in the political system. So if you want real change, that is the true definition of a wasted vote. And the other thing that's for certain is that little more than a dozen independent candidates only capture cumulatively altogether 5% of the total vote, then whoever's elected president will never serve that constituent base represented by that cumulative 5% vote. Now, since US presidential elections happen every 4 years, the independent voters that captured, going back to my hypothetical scenario, that collectively captured 30% of the vote would need to educate not only themselves, but everyone else. Everyone else they know, their colleagues, their family members, their friends, that they need to identify a viable independent candidate for the next upcoming election that at least 10% of them could back. And then they need to stay committed to voting independent in the next presidential election. In this way, they could funnel enough votes to a singular candidate that the next president, even if you had like the 30% cumulative vote with no candidate garnering more than 3% of the vote, so the president still ignored that 30% voting constituency, if you were able to funnel enough votes to a singular candidate that commanded at least 10% of the overall votes, then guess what? The president is going to start serving that constituency, because he knows if his opponent in the next election captures that 10% vote, then that will be the difference between winning or losing the next election. So let's consider that this goal, like that enough people understood how to exercise their power. This happened in 2020. So the next election in 2024, 10% of the cumulative independent vote was captured by one candidate. That candidate still lost, right? But the cumulative total independent party vote rose from 30% to, let's say, 33% of all the entire votes cast for the US president. Now, again, even though that president will then serve this constituency, at least of the 10% of the platform that was desired by the candidate, that captured the 10% of the vote, in the next following election in 2028, the same people, that same 33% of the cumulative vote, has to stay committed to the strategy. They have to vote independent. They can't give in and say, we're going to re-elect the candidate that served our interests because he's in power. Because remember, that incumbent person only served those constituents' interests because he was forced to out of political expediency, not because he wanted to. So by returning back to a two-party system, you're going to give up the power that you garnered for the last 8 years. So the next election in 2028, then you have to apply that same strategy, and perhaps you can get a candidate to up the top candidate from 10% of the vote to garnering the majority of the independent vote. So say the independent vote, third-party vote, can be increased from 33% to like 38% or 40% of the entire vote. And you can get one candidate to garner most of that vote, say like 35% of the vote. That gives that independent party presidential candidate a real chance of winning, and for the first time in our lifetimes, of having a candidate that is willing to serve the interests of all 330 Americans that live in the country, or whatever the population grows to by 12 years down the road. So people that say it's a wasted vote, it's only a wasted vote as long as voters believe they're helpless and powerless. Who wants people to believe that voters are helpless and powerless? The people running the two-party system. So we're just playing into their hands by not recognizing the power that we have. But for every other person that recognizes he or she is not helpless, he or she is not powerless, voting independent can be it's the only strategy for real positive change in the future. So that said, people of color also need to realize that just because someone may share the same skin color or same race with you, that does not mean they have their best interest, your best interest at heart. In fact, in politics, most likely they do not. They often try to parlay this superficial commonality to dupe and deceive as many people as possible to gain the vote of others that may look like them. So I said a million times before, even if Andrew Yang, captured the Democratic nomination this year, which is impossible given the way the current system works. But let's suspend all doubt and say, hypothetically, Andrew Yang captured the Democratic nomination. I'm sure that alone, millions of mindless Americans would simply vote for Yang. Not because they are even familiar with his policies, but just because he would have been the first Asian American candidate for presidency in US history. That would have been enough for millions, I'm guaranteeing you, millions of Americans to blindly vote for him. But I myself would need to more carefully assess his background, his platform. I mean, I did listen to some of it, so I do support a lot of what the platform he was running on, but I would need to do more deep research to assess his background and his platform in greater detail before deciding that Andrew Yang deserved my vote. So if this happens in the future and the incumbent president, because he or she was an independent candidate that won and truly served the American people's interests during his or her first time, And then say Andrew Yang pops up on the scene and runs against the incumbent president. I'm not going to immediately cast my vote for Yang. That's like how a lot of people think today. That is just absurdity. It's such an intellectually lazy way to vote. So I would really have to assess then who is the better candidate of the two that will serve everyone's interests, all Americans' interests, regardless of race, religion, skin color, and most importantly, regardless of wealth, a financial position in life. And then vote for the one that's most willing to serve the interest of everyone. So many people of color should really study Biden and Kamala Harris's track record in the US justice system, because if they did, they will understand this pairing is responsible for so many brown and black people being in prison today. And you shouldn't just blindly cast a vote for them because you say, okay, I understand they put hundreds of thousands of brown and black people in prison. And then many people will resort to the better or worse argument, right? I have to take this action because I can't stand Trump. I think that Biden and Kamala are the lesser of two actions. The lesser of two evils. Or whatever is the lesser poor choice of the two. But you know what? The moral choice is always the best choice. Meaning you vote for the candidate that you believe is the best one. Not just within the two-party binary choices we're given, but of the dozens of independent ones. And yeah, nobody knows much about any of these independent candidates, so it's going to require you to do some research. So while true for this year's election, due to the lack of understanding that people have power in which they can force zero positive change by using, the strategy I just provided, if people keep voting for the candidate they believe is less worse than the other one, then the certain outcome we will receive is that no positive change for the people will ever happen. So if everyone just followed their moral conscience in voting for the best possible candidate that they believed would serve the American people, not the ruling class of oligarchs, which, face it, we all know that this is going to be the outcome, whether Biden or Trump wins, that the oligarchs, that their loyalty is to the oligarchs and no one else. Even if we can't start out with like the 30% of vote captured by the independent vote on a cumulative total basis. But let's say only 3% of the entire vote is captured by independent party members. That's a start. It's a start. Because with further education, like I said, in the next election cycle, then you build that cumulative vote from 3% to 10%, the next cycle from 10% to 25%, the next cycle from 25% to 40%. And at that 40%, you can get all the votes backing the best independent party candidate and get the best independent party candidate elected. So to further illustrate the degree to which the system is rigged and that only positive change can be made by forcing decisions that exist outside of this binary decision matrix, I'm going to predict that the mass media will run a slew of headlines of increasing virus infection numbers in the days before the November 3rd election in the US. Why? Well, clearly much of the US media has shown a great distaste for President Trump during his first 4 years of office. So again, my preference for who wins the 2020 US presidential election is neither Trump or Biden, nor Biden. But one way to hurt his re-election bid, because we all see this, right, in the US mass media, would be to report surging virus infection numbers in the days leading up to the election, simply due to the ignorance of many Americans that their economic misery is not a result of the virus and how Trump has handled the virus. That's what everyone thinks that hates Trump, right? It's all Trump's fault. And they don't understand their economic misery has been created by the politicians and their lockdown actions, right? So they should really be blaming their state governors and municipal mayors in this case, if they understood reality, who, imposed tyrannical lockdowns and self-anointed themselves as kings and queens of regions and territories over which they presided. So, and secondly, I wouldn't even be surprised. In fact, I kind of almost expected, although a little less than I expected from US media, I wouldn't be surprised if China reported a huge outbreak in a major city. And maybe since Wuhan's the best recognized name, they'll report a second lockdown in Wuhan or something days before the election. Why? For the same reason. Because I think that they believe Biden would be more accommodating towards them rather than Trump. Because, Trump's been very hostile in these trade war negotiations. So if they saw an opportunity, I don't actually believe it'd be real. Any type of, massive infection numbers in China again, I think it would be totally fake. But, I almost expect that to be reported by the Chinese state as a means of influencing the election outcome in the United States. So if you see an explosion of headlines coming out of China and the US of exploding virus infection numbers, and in Europe as well, in the days leading up to the election, this may help those of you understand just how the ruling class widely uses, not reality, but their management perception game to affect behavior of the serfs over whom they rule and influence their behavior and consequently influence the outcome of the election. Now I use the term serfs not because that's how I see people, because I'm not calling myself a serf. It's because undoubtedly that's how the ruling class perceives us. So the one aspect of the divisions in the US political game that I've still been unable to determine whether or not is real or part of the management perception game is the presentation of the clash between current President Donald Trump and most of the US alphabet agencies, meaning the intelligence agencies, CIA, NSA, FBI, what else? US Defense Department, DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and so on. There's numerous intelligence agencies, JSOC, go on and on and on. So and that includes even the leaked story about how Trump will immediately fire FBI Director Christopher Wray, I think that's his last name, and CIA Director Gina Haspel reelected. So I'm not saying that that won't happen. I'm just saying that, and I'm not saying these stories are not true. I'm saying they're manufactured quite possibly and quite realistically to give us the impression that Trump is at massive odds with the US intelligence agencies, even though he may really not be. So in other words, even if Trump is reelected, Gina Haspel is fired, Christopher Wray is fired from the FBI, that could just be a move that's deemed necessary by intelligence agency. Those two people are sacrificial lambs in order to maintain this public perception that they're at war with each other and that they hate Trump, when in reality they're working together because Trump is serving the agenda of the oligarchs. So after all, isn't that what intelligence agencies do? When do they ever tell us the truth, right? They deceive and mask the true relationships that exist. So, regarding the leaked stories about how ex-FBI Director James Comey ignored and buried evidence that, quote, U.S. presidential candidate Hillary Clinton's approval of a plan concerning U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump and Russian hackers hampering U.S. elections back in 2016 as a means of distracting the public from her illegal use of her private mail server, end quote, that would have disproven the whole entire Russiagate scandal that cemented most people's opinions that the FBI and President Trump hated each other. How do we know for certain that, again, this wasn't just a planted, manufactured story used as a cover to build a false narrative of how much Trump and the intelligence community hate each other? So again, I know, many people will dismiss this possibility because they'll say, hey, President Trump's not smart enough to accomplish this perception management scheme. But no one's perceptions could ever be successfully managed if they understood that their perceptions were being managed, right? If we knew they're being managed, then there's no perception management scheme that exists. It can only have great success when the targeted audience, meaning us, fail to understand that our perceptions are being actively managed. So if Trump wins re-election, I believe that the narrative built for the past several years of Trump being at tremendous odds with U.S. intelligence agencies has been a false managed one. I think if he wins again, that means that his conflict with the U.S. intelligence agencies has been a false managed perception game. Okay, so just as when I wrap up, Again, thanks. As you all know, all of my content is 100% viewer and listener supported. If you'd like to become a patron for the cost of a Starbucks coffee a month at $5 a month, these are the benefits you'll receive. You'll receive 2 extra long format, audio format only podcasts per month that range in time from 40 minutes to, let's say, 70, 80 minutes a piece. With the first podcast normally being a podcast of a non-financial nature, how to improve the quality of your life, how to improve your critical thinking skills, how to survive these lockdowns, not only survive and thrive. While the second one is generally targeted towards wealth building management schemes. What assets should you be investing in? I review specific options trading strategies that I give people. I review specific stocks that, because there's so few stocks right now that offer good value. But I discuss that with my patrons only, never publicly on YouTube, never publicly on Podbean podcast. You can receive all that for $5 a month. So thanks so much to all my present patrons as well. If you want to become a patron, you can find the link in the podcast show notes. The link is Patreon, patreon.com/SK Wealth Academy. And stay tuned. Please do subscribe to go to my YouTube channel, SK Wealth Academy space podcast. Don't subscribe because there's still an SK Wealth Academy podcast on the YouTube channel that has it used to have 30,000 subscribers. That's 29,000, but that's been completely demonetized, deplatformed. So that's not the one you want. You want the one with a much lesser number of subscribers, like 1.3K subscribers. That's the active one. If you subscribe to that one, I'm probably going to upload an example of a, long format Patreon only podcast. So go subscribe to my YouTube channel. You'll know when that's uploaded. So if you want to sample before you come on board, even though your risk is $5, right? Because if you don't think I provide the tremendous value I think I provide for $5 a month, because some people say, hey, I have people paying me $15, $20 a month. They say, I would easily pay you $20 a month for this information. If you could come in at $5 a month if you think it's not provide the type of utility to you that you would want, you're lost and your entire risk is $5. You can just unsubscribe as a member after 1 month. In any event, go check it out. Thanks so much for coming and listening. Please comment below too. Let me know what you think. Does this sound like a reasonable, because do me this one favor, especially if you listen to the end. Does this sound like a reasonable strategy to force positive change? Do you agree with me that if we continue to vote for just the major party candidates offered to us, I don't care if it's like the Labour or Tory party in the UK, this applies to every nation's electoral process. If you force change by voting for a third party candidate, it would be, I know it would require a tremendous amount of education, but you have to start somewhere. So you can't keep saying, I don't want to waste my vote this year and not do it. You have to start somewhere. Like I said, even if all the independent party candidates alone only capture 3% of the cumulative vote, then, people say, well, why did you waste your vote voting for Jesse Ventura? Why did you waste your vote voting for the Libertarian Party candidate? Why did you waste your vote voting for Kanye? That's just stupid. You can explain why. It's not that you believe that any of these candidates would win, but that you understand it's part of our process to force positive change. Let me know if you agree with me in that, and then if you will do me the solid in educating people about the process by which we have the power to force positive change and to force politicians to actually serve us. Okay, thanks so much for listening. As always, remain intensely curious. More importantly, remain immensely courageous and learn how to thrive. Because as dark as the outlook appears to be for 2021, because as I said, all these compliance measures that are enforced upon us and that were inflicted with by our politicians are not going to magically disappear with the new year. But that doesn't mean we have to be depressed and anxious all the time. If we're proactive about it, we can learn how to thrive. And not only learn how to thrive, but get a tremendous amount of satisfaction with realizing our human potential for perhaps the first time in our lives. So this is not a difficult thing. When things are really difficult to achieve, guess what that does? That gives us a tremendous amount of confidence in ourselves for the first time in our lives that we possibly may have never had before, because we say, wow, I didn't think I really could achieve that. So you have to be proactive and start acting now. Okay, thanks so much for watching, and bless up to everyone. Take care.